There is a small clay lamp burning in a one-room house in Galilee, and no one wants to be the one to blow it out. The oil is low. You can see it. When the flame dips, that little shudder, that thinning of the light against the wall. There is enough for tonight. Maybe. And everyone in the house knows what everyone in the house is thinking, though no one says it out loud, because saying it makes it real. Tomorrow we will need more oil. And to buy oil, we need coin. And the coin depends on the catch, or the harvest, or whether the tax man comes early this season. So the lamp burns, and the family lies awake around it, doing the math. Again, this was not a rare night in Galilee. This was most nights. The historian Josephus, who chronicled this world in the 1st century, describes a hard-pressed countryside, fishermen, farmers, day laborers, taxed from above, and living close to the edge. These were not people who needed a lecture on worry. These were people who breathed it. Worry was the air in the room, thick as lamp smoke. And here is the strange thing. Into that room, into that exact kind of life, a carpenter's son is about to sit down on a hillside and say the words, "Do not be anxious." Now, stay with me, because if you have ever heard those words and felt them land like a scolding, like one more thing you are failing at, then you have never really heard them at all. You have a lamp too. It is not made of clay. Yours burns at the ceiling of a dark bedroom, or behind your eyes at 3 in the morning, or in the blue glow of a phone you swore you would put down an hour ago. And the oil in yours is running low the same way theirs did. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. This is not a lecture about calming down. This is not a clever trick to quiet your head. This is not a verse to hang on the wall and ignore. This is about what Jesus actually did with an anxious person. And what he did was stranger and gentler and far more useful than anything you have been told. He did not tell them to feel less. He told them to look somewhere else. And there was a man on that hillside that day, a fisherman, with the smell of the lake still on his hands, who would spend the rest of his life learning what that meant. His worst night was still years away. We will get to him, but not yet. So the crowd climbs the hill, and the carpenter sits down. And that detail matters more than it looks. In that world, a teacher stood to read and sat to teach. When a rabbi sat, it meant, this is not a passing remark. This is the real thing. Listen. And the first thing he does with their worry is give it a name. The word Matthew writes down, Matthew, who is sitting somewhere in that crowd, a man who spent his whole life measuring the worth of things by the coins in a box. The word is Merimnao. We flatten it into English as worry or be anxious. But the Greek is sharper than that. Merimnao comes from a root that means to divide, to pull apart, to tear in 2 directions at once. Sit with that, because it means the ancient world understood something we forget. Worry isn't really a feeling at all. It's more like a crack running quietly through the middle of you. It is the mind pulled toward tomorrow while the body is stuck in today. It is being in the room and not in the room. You are at the dinner table, and you are also in the meeting that hasn't happened yet. You are holding your child, and you are also standing in the hospital that may never exist. Worry takes one person and quietly saws them into pieces. Matthew would have felt this in his bones. Here was a man whose entire identity was a ledger, who was rich and hated for it, and never safe, because a tax collector's wealth could be seized by Rome or stolen by neighbors on any given morning. His treasure was real, and his treasure could vanish, and so his mind was permanently divided between counting what he had and dreading its loss. He did not need a definition of Merimnao. He was the definition, and he was about to hear a carpenter tell him there was another way to live. Here's what most people miss. Jesus does not follow the diagnosis with a command to try harder. He does not say, stop it. He does not say, have more faith, you weak thing. Watch what he does instead. He points. Look at the birds of the air, he says. They do not sow, or reap, or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Now, the word for look here is not a casual glance. It is katanosate, to observe closely, to study, to consider a thing, until you actually understand it. Jesus is not telling the crowd to notice the scenery. He is telling them to become students of a sparrow. And there were sparrows, right there, flitting through the grass on the hillside, as he spoke, landing and lifting, doing nothing to earn the day, and receiving it anyway. He is not quoting a poem about birds. He is pointing at the ones in front of them and saying that. Learn from that. Somewhere in the crowd, there is a widow. She is not named, but she is there because she was always there in a crowd like this, a woman with no husband to work the land and no son old enough to fish, living out of a single clay jar that gets lighter every week. When Jesus says, "Do not worry about what you will eat," those words do not float over her head as poetry. They land on her like a dare. She is the one person on that hillside for whom this teaching is almost unbearable, because she truly does not know where tomorrow's bread is coming from. This is not an anxious executive missing sleep over a promotion. This is a woman one empty jar away from hunger. Picture the jar. It sits in the corner of her house, where the floor is coolest, and every few days she lifts the lid and looks inside and does the arithmetic that has no answer. So many handfuls of grain, so many mouths, so many days until it's gone. She has learned to tilt the jar and scrape the bottom with the flat of her hand because a spoon leaves too much behind. She measures her whole life in what that jar will and will not hold. And when a stranger on a hillside tells her not to worry about tomorrow's bread, part of her wants to laugh and part of her wants to weep, because worry is the only thing she has ever been able to afford. It costs nothing, and it feels like doing something. It feels like control, and he is asking her to set down the one activity that has kept her sane. You know that feeling. You have held a worry so long it started to feel like love, like proof that you care, like the price of admission for the people you're afraid to lose. And here is the tenderness people rush past. Jesus does not tell her the jar will magically fill. He tells her to look at the bird, a creature with no jar at all, no barn, no plan, no savings. And he says her father knows the difference between a sparrow and a daughter. Are you not much more valuable than they? He is not denying that tomorrow is real. He is changing what she stares at while she waits for it. But it gets stranger, because he doesn't stop at birds. He turns and points the other direction, at the wildflowers running loose across the slope, the ones a farmer would tear out as weeds by the end of the week. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you that even Solomon, in all his glory, was not dressed like one of these. Feel the size of that claim. Solomon, the richest king Israel ever produced, a man whose table and robes and gold were legendary 1,000 years later, Solomon in his finest hour was outdressed by a weed. A flower that does no work, earns no wage, and is gone in a day was wearing something the wealthiest man in history could not buy. And the point is not that flowers are pretty. The point is a question he lets hang in the air. If God clothes the grass of the field, grass that is here today, and thrown into the oven tomorrow, how much more will he clothe you? Wonder was the first note, then the tension of the ledger, then the grief of the empty jar. And now, for the first time on that hillside, something lifts. Something like hope. Because a man who tells you to look at birds and flowers is not shaming your fear. He is trying to unclench your hands, one finger at a time. He is standing in front of the most anxious people in the empire, the fishermen, the widows, the hated tax men, and he is not adding to their burden. He is teaching them where to point their eyes. Let me stop the story for just a moment, because I don't want you to miss the shape of what he is doing. Every single move so far has been the same move. He names the fear honestly, and then, instead of arguing with the fear, he turns your head. The birds, the flowers, the Father who knows. He is not handing anxious people a stronger grip. He is loosening the grip they already have and pointing their eyes at something steadier than tomorrow. That's the pattern. Hold on to it, because in a minute it's going to cost him something to prove it. If this is landing on you, if you know the 3 in the morning ceiling I'm talking about, do me one small thing. Subscribe, so the next one finds you. And down in the comments, tell me the one worry that's been dividing you lately. Not the polite version, the real one. I read them, and you'd be surprised how often the person who needed to hear their own words was you. All right, back to the hill, because up to now he's been gentle, and he's about to get honest. Here is the honest part. In the middle of all this tenderness, Jesus stops and asks a question that has no comfortable answer. Which of you, he says, by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life? Sit in that for a second, because it's sharper than it sounds. He is not saying worry is wrong because it feels bad. He is saying worry is wrong because it does not work. It has never worked. Not once, in the history of the human race, has a single anxious thought lengthened a single life by a single hour. You can lie awake rehearsing tomorrow until the sky turns gray, and you will not have changed tomorrow. You will only have lost tonight. That is the cruelty of Merimnao. It takes real time, the only life you actually have, which is the present one, and it spends that time on a future that hasn't arrived and may never come. Worry is a tax you pay on a debt you may never owe. And then he says something that could sound like an insult until you look closer. He calls them oligopistos. Oh, you of little faith. Now, if you grew up in church, you've heard that phrase used like a slap. Little faith. As if he's disappointed. As if the anxious are second-class believers who just need to try harder. But look at the word. Oligos means small. Pistis means faith. He does not say they have no faith. He says they have little faith, faith that is real, but shrunken. Faith that has been squeezed down to the size of the crisis in front of it. It is a rebuke, but not a verdict, that they have no faith. He is not calling the widow faithless. He is telling her that her faith is real. It has just gotten smaller than the fear in front of it, the way anything shrinks when you stare at it through the wrong end of your fear. Here's the part nobody tells you. Just before all of this, in the same breath, Jesus said something that unlocks the whole thing. Where your treasure is, he said, there your heart will be also. And suddenly the worry teaching and the money teaching are revealed to be the same teaching. They were never two subjects. Worry and treasure are one disease wearing two masks. Because you do not lie awake at night over things you do not treasure. Nobody loses sleep guarding what they don't value. The reason your mind divides, the reason it tears toward tomorrow, is that something you love is sitting out there in the dark, unguarded, and you are trying to protect it with the only tool a divided mind has. Rehearsal. You replay it. You defend it in your head at 2 in the morning against enemies who aren't even in the room. Jesus looks at that exhausting midnight arithmetic and says, your heart went wherever your treasure went. If your treasure is a thing that can be lost, your heart will spend every night bracing for the loss. But if your treasure is somewhere it can never be stolen, your heart finally gets to rest. Which brings us to a man who is not on the hillside. Not yet born into this story, but who would one day take these exact words and stake his life on them. His name was Paul, and years after, that day on the hill, Paul sat in a Roman prison, chained to a guard, with a real trial ahead of him and a real chance of execution, and from that cell he wrote a letter. In it he said, do not be anxious about anything. Merimnao, the same word. But in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Understand where those words are coming from. This is not a comfortable man telling comfortable people to relax. This is a prisoner with a sword hanging over his neck, telling free people how he himself is not afraid. He is not saying anxiety is easy to defeat. He is saying he found the somewhere else to look, and he found it in a cell where he had nothing left to protect but the one treasure no chain could reach. Picture that cell for a second. It is not a poem. There is a chain, and the chain is fastened to a soldier's wrist, which means Paul is never alone and never free, even to sleep, even to pray. There is another man's arm a few inches from his own. There is a strip of light that crosses the floor in the morning and is gone by afternoon. There are footsteps in the corridor, and Paul has learned to tell the difference between the ones that pass by and the ones that stop. Any set of footsteps that stops could be the ones that lead to a Roman sword. This is the man who writes, do not be anxious about anything. Not from a garden, not from a comfortable study, from here. And that is exactly why, 2,000 years later, we still believe him. And notice what Paul adds that we tend to skip. He does not just say stop worrying. He says, pray. He gives the divided mind something to do with the fear. Take the thing that is tearing you in two and hand it, out loud, on purpose, to someone bigger than the night. Hold that thought, because we're almost to the part of the story where a fisherman finds out whether any of this is true. And it costs him more than it has cost anyone yet. If you've made it this far, with me, you already know this one's worth finishing. So stay to the end. The last 2 minutes are the whole reason I made this. So the carpenter comes to the end of it. And he gathers everything he has said, the birds, the flowers, the divided mind, the treasure, the little faith, and he presses it down into one sentence. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. That is the somewhere else. That is the direction he has been turning their heads toward the entire time. He is not saying your needs don't matter. He just told them their father counts sparrows and clothes weeds. Of course the needs matter. He is saying the order matters. Chase the kingdom first, and the anxious math of your life falls into a hand larger than your own. Chase the needs first, and you will chase them forever, in the dark, alone, adding not 1 hour. And then he says the sentence I want you to carry out of this video. Do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Now think about what that actually means, because it is more merciful than it first appears. He is not promising tomorrow will be easy. Read it again. He admits tomorrow has trouble in it. He is not lying to you about the future. He is doing something far kinder. He is telling you that you were never asked to carry tomorrow because you don't live there yet. Here is the thing about grace. It is not delivered in advance. The strength you will need for the worst day of your life has not been given to you tonight, because tonight is not that day. You are trying to feel, right now, a strength that is scheduled to arrive later. And of course you can't. You are standing in Tuesday, demanding the grace for Friday, and then panicking because your hands are empty. They're empty because it isn't Friday. You were only ever given one day. This one. And one day, you can carry. Now, you know the room I mean. It's dark. It's somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. The ceiling has turned into a screen, and it's playing every version of tomorrow you can't control. There's a phone glowing on the nightstand, and its light is the color of dread. You are lying perfectly still, and inside your skull you are being torn in half. Merimnao, pulled toward 100 tomorrows, while your body is trapped in this one bed, in this 1 hour, exhausted and awake. That room is where this teaching was always headed. The whole thing was never really about a hillside in Galilee. It was about your bedroom, tonight. And here is what nobody warns you about that room. In the daylight, your problems have edges. You can look at them, size them, sometimes even solve them. But at 3 in the morning, in the dark, every worry loses its edges and turns to fog, and fog is worse than a wall, because you cannot find where it starts or where it ends. A fear you could name at noon becomes a shapeless dread at 3, and so you lie there, negotiating with a future that hasn't shown up, rehearsing conversations that may never happen, burying people who are still alive, and well, and sleeping down the hall. This is Merimnao doing its full work. Not gently. It takes the one mind you have and runs it in 6 directions until you are exhausted and awake at the same time, the cruelest combination a human body can hold. And now, finally, we come back to the fisherman. I told you at the very beginning that there was a man on that hillside whose worst night was still years away. I asked you to hold that thought. It's time. He was a big man, loud, the kind who speaks before he thinks and loves before he's sure. He had heard every word of this sermon, with the smell of the lake still on his hands, and he believed it. He really did. The way you believe something on a bright afternoon on a green hill, with the teacher standing right in front of you, because belief comes easily on a bright afternoon. His name was Simon, Peter, and years later, Peter walked straight into the worst night of his life, a courtyard, a charcoal fire, a servant girl's question, a rooster he would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. The night he swore 3 times that he had never known the man who taught him not to be afraid. He wept in the dark, that night the way you weep when you find out exactly how small your faith really was. The same question the carpenter had raised years earlier now seemed to live inside him. What happens when your faith becomes smaller than your fear? If anyone had earned the right to be destroyed by anxiety, to be torn apart by it for good, It was Peter, after that night. He carried the guilt, and he replayed the whole thing on a loop, putting himself on trial at 3 in the morning as both the accused and the judge. But watch what Peter does with the rest of his life. Decades later, an old man now, he picks up a pen and writes to frightened, scattered Christians who are losing everything. And of all the things he could have told them, he writes this: cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Cast it, throw the whole weight off yourself and onto someone else. This is not the language of a man managing his feelings. This is a man who learned, the hard way, on his worst night, that the divided heart was never meant to hold the weight alone, that the whole point of that day on the hill was that you were allowed to hand it over. Centuries later, another man would put the same truth in 7 words. Our heart is restless until it rests in you. A restless heart is just another name for a divided one. And rest is what happens when it finally turns toward home. This is not a story about a technique. This is not a story about positive thinking. This is not a story about pretending tomorrow is safe. This is a story about a carpenter on a hill who looked at the most frightened people in the empire, and instead of shaming their fear, took their faces gently in his hands and turned them toward the birds, toward the flowers, toward the Father, toward today, and said the words you have needed to hear your whole life. Do not be anxious, not because there's nothing out there in the dark, but because you are not the one holding it up. So before you go back to your life, let me leave you with 3 things to take with you. The first is this: your worry is not a character flaw. It is a fracture. That's what the word means, Merimnao, a mind torn in 2 directions at once. And when Jesus called anxious people of little faith, he was not insulting them. He was diagnosing them with a hand on the shoulder. Little faith is not no faith. It is real faith that has been squeezed small by staring too long at the wrong thing. So stop treating your anxiety as proof that something is wrong with you. It is proof that you are human and that you love something you're afraid to lose. The second is what to do about it. Jesus never once told an anxious person to simply feel less. Not once. What he offered was not a feeling, it was an action. Look somewhere else. Cast it off yourself. Hand the thing that's tearing you apart, out loud and on purpose, to someone bigger than the night. Peter called it casting. Paul called it prayer. Both of them meant the same thing. Worry is a weight you were never meant to carry alone, and the whole invitation of that hillside was that you're allowed to put it down. And the third, the one I hope follows you home. Anxiety only ever asks one question: what about tomorrow? But you have never once set foot in tomorrow. You don't live there. The strength for the hardest day of your life has not been handed to you tonight, and it was never supposed to be, because tonight is not that day. The grace comes with the day it's meant for, not before. So tonight, you were given exactly 1 day to carry. And 1 day you can carry. So here's my question for you, and I really do want the answer. What's the worry that finds you at 3 in the morning? The one that turns your ceiling into a screen? Tell me down in the comments. Say it out loud, right there in the open, where it's a little harder for it to grow in the dark. Because somewhere in Galilee, there was a small clay lamp burning in a 1-room house, and a family lying awake around it, doing the math on tomorrow's oil. They never got the guarantee they wanted. Nobody promised them the jar would stay full. They were only ever given enough light for tonight. And it turns out, that was always enough.